We begin by thanking the sponsors. The Talmud Torah sponsor of the month, Dr. Steve and Dr. Teri Czinn, in loving memory of Teri's father, Dr. Kahn, Tzvi Hirsh ben Yosef HaKohen and his 10th yartzeit, as well as Paul and Kathy Pollack, in memory of Paul's grandfather, Zechariah ben Zechariah, and grandmother, Dinah Bastov, who were niftar in the month of Adar. The nishmas should have an Aliyah, and the family should have an Chama. As well, we thank our sponsors for the week of learning, an anonymous sponsor, the nishmas, Moshe Aharon Alter ben Yosef Binyamin, Zechariah on his first yartzeit, on the 6th of Adar, nishmas, Sara Deena bas Elimelech, and the Shabbat should have an Aliyah. Today's daf is Nazir, daf Lamed Zayin. Does anybody know if the Rav left off by the Eisvei at the bottom of Lamed Vav on the Beis, or got to the top of Lamed Zayin of it Aleph?
At the top.
At the top? Okay, good. All right, so we'll begin at the top. Let's just quickly recap what happens over here. If we go back to the beginning of the parak, in the Mishnah, Rabbi Kiva says, Rabbi Kiva Omer, Afilu Shara Pitu Bayayin, V'yesh Bo Kedei L'tzaref Kezayis Chai. Rabbi Kiva has this opinion that when it comes to the Isurim of a Nazir, if he soaks his bread inside wine, so bread is a permissible food for a Nazir. Wine, obviously, is a forbidden food for a Nazir. So he soaks his bread inside the wine, and then at the end of the day, he pulls it out, and when you measure it all up, you're able to have a tziruf, a combination of wine and bread, which equals a kezayis. Says Rabbi Akiva, you're going to be chayiv. In other words, this is the concept of tziruf, combining two foods together, one being heter, one being iser, which is called heter mitzdaref le'iser. You combine the permissible food with the forbidden food, and if you have a grand total, a sum of a kezayis, even though you only have that kezayis because of the food which is permissible, because of the heter, nevertheless, the halacha is you are going to be chayiv. That's the halacha of Rabbi Kiva in the Mishnah. The last amud, we focused on the bottom of Daf Lamed Hey Amud Beis on a line from Rabbi Vo. Rabbi Vo said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that Kol Yisurin Shabbat Torah ein heter mitzdaref le'iser chutz mi'yisuri nazir. This halach of Rabbi Akiva, you could combine permissible foods with forbidden foods, and if you have a total of a shear, of a kezayis, even though the total is only going to be reached by virtue of the fact that you mixed heter and iser, that halacha is only true when it comes to the halachas of Nazir. That's the line, Kol Yisurin Shabbat Torah ein heter mitzdaref iser chutz mi'yisuri Nazir. In other words, this is a novelty when it comes to the halachas of Nazir. When it comes to a Nazir, you could combine permissible foods with forbidden foods to reach the shear, and he says, because the Torah says nishmas. Yesterday's Amud was challenging this halacha for the most part. Yesterday's Amud basically was trying to teach us that, hold on a second, is this really true? Perhaps you could actually apply the halacha of heter mitzdaref le'iser, which means to combine permissible foods with forbidden foods in other cases as well. So we're going to start here on the top of Daf Lamed Zayin Amud Aleph from Amar Le Abaya. So about 5 lines to the top. Amar Le Abaya. So Abaya now said back to Mimai Tehai Mishras Leheter Mitzdaref Le'iser Hu Da'asa. The whole source of this halacha that you could combine permissible foods with forbidden foods comes from the word mishras. That's the word in the Torah which tells us when you have this food which is soaked with wine. So hold on. Abaya says, let's challenge the whole premise over here. Who said that the halacha of heter mitzdaref le'iser is even true? Maybe the word mishras does not teach us that. Rather, what does it teach us? Dilma litain tam ke'ikar hu da'asa. Maybe the age-old rule that we know called tam ke'ikar, which literally means that the taste of a forbidden food actually has the halacha of the forbidden food. Maybe that halacha is learned from Mishra. So the Gemara goes on to a little pause over here, but let's just explain it. We are very familiar with the concept of tam ke'ikar, and that's why we have milchei kelim, that's why we have fleishei kelim, that's why we have pesach kelim, that's why we have kosher kelim. That means if a person has a pot, you have to make sure before you're going to cook your meatballs in it that the pot wasn't used to cook milk or cheese. Why? The pot is clean. The answer is because the pot absorbs flavor inside it, and that flavor can then be transferred to the next food. Similarly, if I have meat cooking in a pot, and inside the same pot I added some milk, so now even if I just simply pull the meat out and don't drink the milk, the meat is forbidden because it absorbs the taste of the milk. And the same thing would be true with regard to kosher and non-kosher. If I have a pot cooking with a bunch of kosher meat inside it, and I add in a couple pieces of non-kosher meat, even if I were to take out the kosher meat from the pot, the halacha is I can't eat it because it absorbs flavor from the non-kosher meat. That's the concept of tam ke'ikr. So now, perhaps the word mishras in the pasuk, which we use to teach us the idea of heter mitzdaref l'isser, maybe that whole thing is not true. Maybe the mishras is not teaching us the concept that you can add kosher food to non-kosher food to fulfill a minimum size of a kazayas, an olive size. Maybe this halacha of mishras is just teaching me that old rule of tam ke'ikr, that if I have the flavor of non-kosher food absorbed into kosher food, the kosher food actually transforms into non-kosher food. Now the Gemara says, hold on a second. Abaya, can you make up your mind? Well, Abaya, mikara kakashale maika amar of dimi. V'kamaisavle kol halein to yufta. Hadar amar litin tam ke'ikr. The Gemara asks, hold on a second, Abaya. Yesterday, you're trying to challenge the premise that the halacha of heter mitzdaref l'isser is limited to Nazir. In other words, yesterday's Talmud was saying that this idea of combination, the whole Gemara yesterday was challenging this idea that it would be limited to Nazir. And you were asking, no, it should be relevant in so many other cases. And now you're flipping yourself a complete 180 degrees, and now you're asking that the whole thing is not true. Yesterday you wanted to say it applies all over the place. Today you want to say it doesn't apply anywhere? What's going on? So the Gemara says, indeed. Hadar Amarle Litin Tam Ke'ikr, but the Gemara says, Basra Deshani Le Amarle Dimalitin Tam Ke'ikr Huda Asa. In other words, the Gemara says the Abaye was asking legitimate questions. He got legitimate answers. He was engaged in an honest conversation. He's being intellectually honest over here. He asked questions, got answers. Now he's on to step 2. In other words, Abaye is not hooked on his original statement. Abaye was asking questions to learn. Abaye heard a statement which said that Mishras teaches us a halacha of heter mitzdaref l'isser, that you could combine forbidden foods with permissible foods. And Abaye asked yesterday, okay, hold on a second, is that halacha only true by Nazir? And once Abaye found that indeed it's really limited to only Nazir, now he wants to say, hold on a second, maybe the whole premise is not true. Maybe Mishras is teaching us tam ke'ikr. So that's what the Gemara says. Basra Dashanile, once he answered him, Amar le dilma litin tam ke'ikr huda asa, and the Gemara actually goes ahead and explains, it substantiates Abaye's question. Look at the Tanya for it says in the Brisa, Mishras, the word Mishras teaches us, litin tam ke'ikr. In other words, we do have a Brisa, which teaches us that the word Mishras, the extra word of Mishras anavim, teaches us that the flavor of something is like the substance, the actual item. She'im shara anavim b'mayim. If a person went and soaked grapes in water, v'yesh batam yayin chayev. So a person takes grapes off the shelf in the grocery store, comes home, he wants to wash them off, and he soaks them in a pot of water. He leaves them there for a significant enough amount of time that the grapes are able to bleed their flavor into the water. He takes all the grapes out of the water, puts them in the fridge, and he says, I don't eat grapes because I'm a Nazir. And he says, but chaval to spill all this water down the drain. So he takes the water from that basin he was soaking it in, and he makes a shahakal and he drinks it. Now he says, hold on a second. This water actually tastes like wine. So now, or grape juice. So halach is chayav, thank you very much. So, so he actually is chayiv for drinking that water. Now it's important to understand. He's not chayiv because within that water there is a kezayis of grape juice. That's not the point. If there was a kezayis of grape juice, that gets to yesterday's discussion of kezayis b'te'achilas pras, and that gets to the discussion of hetem mitzaref le'isser. What the Gemara simply means is, you're drinking water. It's really water. And the water itself, he drinks a share of water, but the water tastes like wine. So because the water tastes like wine, the water is actually transformed into halachic wine. So you see very clearly that we have a brayso that says that when it comes to Nazir, the word mishras, the extra word mishras, teaches us that you could transform an item of heter into an item of isser by virtue of the fact that it actually tastes like the isser. And that's the fundamental difference between heter mitzaref le'isser and tam ke'ikar. Heter mitzaref le'isser acknowledges that the permissible food is permissible and the forbidden food is forbidden. However, there's this novel idea that if you don't have enough of the forbidden food, you can fill in the missing amount of food that you need for the shear, for the minimum requirement, by adding in something which is kosher. The idea of tam ke'ikar is that everybody agrees that everything that I ate was permissible food. It was a cup of water. The problem with this cup of water is that this cup of water tastes like wine, and now that permissible food actually transforms into the isser itself. So even though I'm not actually eating isser, I am drinking something which is totally, technically permissible. The fact that it tastes like isser, the fact that it has a taste of something which is forbidden, that makes it usher. Now, I know this might be obvious, but again, just to point it out, it doesn't mean that if you have an artificial flavor of something which is forbidden, then it's usher. In other words, you're allowed to have, a potato chip, which has an artificial flavor of whatever item it might be, which is non-kosher. It has to be, let's say if you have a bacon-flavored potato chip. Now, if they were able to generate the flavor of bacon by mixing together some spices and whatever else you don't want to know is in there, that's not a problem, because there's nothing isser. What we're talking about is when you actually use a forbidden item to transform its flavor from the real, bona fide, prohibited item into a kosher item, then if the kosher item absorbs that flavor, it's going to actually transform into isser. Now the Gemara actually says, "Umikan." That brayso says, "Mikan atadan kol yisur Shabbat Torah." We learn from Nazir that tam ke'ikar is relevant in all areas of the Torah. And the Gemara explains. In other words, we're explaining if you soak grapes in water, it transforms the water into what would be halachically wine. The Gemara says you can learn this all other Yisurim of the Torah. And that's like we mentioned at the beginning of this year. That's why if a person has a pot of food that's cooking and an isser, forbidden food, falls in, if it lends its flavor to the rest of the pot's going to be usser, even if the guy is not a Nazir, even if the food is not forbidden to a Nazir, if it's simply nevela. Gemara explains, Uman Nazir she'ein isuro isra olam. A Nazir is not an isra olam, because a stam Nazir, how long does he remain a Nazir for? For 30 days. The ein isuro is isra hana, and a Nazir does not have a problem to derive benefit from grape juice. The example that Rashi gives is that he could be included in an eruv that was set up using forbidden foods for another. In other words, if they made an eruv with wine, he's still allowed to be included in that eruv. If yesh heter yisuro, he could ultimately go to a rav and reverse his nazirus. In other words, we discussed this concept before this Masechta, about how he can go to a rav to reverse his nazirus, or to nullify his nazirus. So in other words, it has these three redeeming factors. Number one, it doesn't last forever. Number two, he's allowed to derive benefit from it. Number three, he can reverse it. So there are these three leniencies, these three kulas, with regard to Nazir. And still, it has within it this chumrah of asavo tam ke'ikar. Nevertheless, the pasuk was explicit that if you're going to soak grapes in water, it's going to be us. In other words, the concept of tam ke'ikr, the flavor is like the essence. So certainly klai karem, when it comes to klayim, forbidden mixtures in the vineyard, she'isuran isra olam, once a person plants the wrong type of seeds inside the vineyard, it becomes asr forever. It's not only asr for 30 days. V'isuran isra hanaya, it's actually asr to benefit from those plants. The ein heter l'isuran, you can't go to the Rav and say, you know what, forget it. I want to reverse this klayim. Din, wouldn't it stand to reason that the din would be the same? Shiyasa botam ke'ikr, that there would be a problem if you actually add klayim into your dish and it lends its flavor to the rest of the dish. That would be aser. Gemara says, "V'hu din la'arla b'shtayim." It's true with regard to arla with two of these things, or in the second year. There's two ways of understanding it. But the idea here is that when it comes to arla, you would have two of them. If you look at Rashi, "V'hu din la'arla b'shtayim," she'isuro isra hana arla, which means the first 3 years that a tree is planted, you can't eat from the fruits. Now it's an isra hana. Now let it benefit from the fruits that grow in the tree for the first 3 years. The ein heter l'isuro. You can't reverse that isser. In other words, the fruits that grow in the first 3 years are the fruits that grow in the first 3 years, and there's no way of reversing that. So again, it has two of the chumras, two of the stringencies over Nazir. So in other words, we see that's the rationale why you'd be able to carry over the halacha of tam ke'ikr from Nazir to other isurim in the Torah. So Amalei Ahumi Rabbanan, one of the Rabbanan said back to Abaya. In other words, we still have this question from Abaya of how do we know that Mishras teaches us the halacha of tziruf, of combination, of heter mitzaref l'isser. Maybe the idea of Mishras teaches us the halacha of tam ke'ikr instead. So Amalei Ahumi Rabbanan, or Bavo, Kika Amar Rabbi Akiva. When did Rabbi Vo say that the word Mishras teaches us the halacha of heter mitzaref l'isser and not the halacha of tam ke'ikr? That was according to Rabbi Akiva. The Gemara says, which Rabbi Akiva are you talking about? Hey, Rabbi Akiva, which Rabbi Akiva is this? Ilay Rabbi Akiva dahacha. If you're going to tell me that it's Rabbi Akiva dahacha, which means Rabbi Akiva in our Mishnah, Ditnan, for it says in the Mishnah, Rabbi Akiva Omer, Rabbi Akiva says, Afilu Sara Pitu Bayayin. Even a person who soaks his bread in wine. V'yesh bo kedei l'tzaref kezayis chayiv, which is our Rabbi Akiva, that if a person soaks his bread in wine, and he has the sum total at the end of a kezayis between the bread and the wine, he's going to be chayiv for eating that slice of bread. Umimai. How do you know that Rabbi Akiva doesn't hold of tam ke'ikr? Dilma hu de'ika kezayis be'ena. Maybe it's talking about where there was a kezayis. V'chitema ma'ila meimar. In other words, if you're going to tell me, so what's the point? What's the chiddush if there's a kezayis? Gemara says, in other words, it could be that Rabbi Akiva's whole point over here is to tell you that you had a full kezayis. So now hold on, if you had a full kezayis, then what's the whole chiddush? The whole idea of heter mitzaref l'isser is, if I don't have a full kezayis. So how can you tell me it's talking about where he has a full kezayis? The Gemara says, you know what the chiddush is? The chiddush is that Rabbi Akiva says you're chayiv on a kezayis, you don't need to have a revius. Now the obvious question over here is, so say that. Why do you have to tell me this whole halacha of heter mitzaref l'isser to bring out the idea that you're chayiv for a kezayis instead of a revius? It would be much more simple to say, Rabbi Akiva Omer chayiv im shasa kezayis. We could have saved ourselves 2 blot of Gemara. But ultimately, Ella, so in other words, the Gemara says it must be that it's not that Rabbi Akiva. It's not the Rabbi Akiva from our Mishnah. Ella Rabbi Akiva de Brisa. It must be a different Rabbi Akiva. Tanya first says in Brisa, Rabbi Akiva says, Nazir sheshara pitu bayayin. A Nazir who soaked his bread in wine, v'achal kezayis mipas umiyayin. So very clear. It's very clear that what he's saying is you ate a full, total kezayis. How did you get to that kezayis? By adding together the pas and the yayin. And there, Rabbi Akiva, if you look at Tosfos, El Rabbi Akiva de Brisa, the Mefarish Ba Behedya, It's 4 lines from the bottom of the page. Once we know that Rabbi Akiva says this in the Brisa, so that means in the Mishnah he also meant that it was talking about a case where you had the sum total of a kazayas at the end. Part of it was wine, part of it was bread. So you see very clearly that Rabbi Akiva is teaching us specifically the halacha of heter mitzdarf le'isser and not the halacha of tam ke'ikr. So Amar le'Rabacha breid of Avi le'Rashi. Rabbi Akiva de kamaykim le'lahai v'chol mishras leheter mitzdarf le'isser litim tam ke'ikr minola. So the Gemara says, okay, fine. So let's just take this as a fact. According to Rabbi Akiva, he understands that Mishras is teaching me the idea, the concept of combination, not the idea of Tam Ke'ikr. And that was Abaya's question. So now, how does he know the idea of Tam Ke'ikr? So fine, let's just accept this. Let's accept that he uses the pasuk of V'chol Mishras Anavim to teach you the concept of combination and not to teach you the concept of Tam Ke'ikr. So now, how does he know the idea of Tam Ke'ikr? Now, what's the obvious question? The obvious question is what Tosfos asks on the bottom. Who said Rabbi Akiva holds of the idea of Tam Ke'ikr? In other words, you can't just make up a premise that Rabbi Akiva holds of Tam Ke'ikr and then say, how do you know it? Rabbi Akiva never discussed it. So Tosfos asks, V'im Tomar, V'dil Maleslei. Maybe he doesn't hold of Tam Ke'ikr. In other words, this is the famous joke. How do you know that Yaakov Avinu wore a strimel? The answer is, of course he wore a strimel. It says, Vayetzi Yaakov in Beersheba. He went outside. Now, who would go outside without a strimel? Obviously, the logic over here is missing, because you make this hanacha, of course. Let's just say everyone knows that you never go outside without a strimel. Now, the pasuk says that Yaakov Avinu went out. He must have been wearing a strimel. Now, it's the same thing Tosfos is asking over here. You make this hanacha, you set this precedent over here, that everybody holds of Tam Ke'ikr. And now we have this kasha. Where do you know it from? You used up your pasuk. Maybe backtrack a little bit. Maybe start by asking, do you hold of Tam Ke'ikr? And then we'll ask you where you know it from. The Tosfos says, V'yeshlom etavadai, ilo deshaminun mikra achrina, Tam Ke'ikr lo havi muki, mishras letmin starf l'isser. Tosfos says, from a logical perspective, if you're going to reach the conclusion, you could combine heter and isser to create an isser, then logically you would have certainly concluded that Tam Ke'ikr comes first. Why? The tfei havi mistaver l'ukmi mishras litin Tam Ke'ikr kivan diyesh be'isser atzmo kezayis el she'enu be'en el tamo mishom hachi boy me'ezer karnafkli. So basically, Tosfos explains that logically, from a logical perspective, it's an easier thing to swallow. You could have Tam Ke'ikr than to swallow that you would say heter mitzdarf le'isser. So in other words, it's not just putting down this basic premise over here that everybody wears a strimel, so therefore everybody holds a Tam Ke'ikr. Because the idea over here it would be similar to saying, well, okay, let's not get carried away with our Chassidish drasha over here. But the idea over here is that, again, once you logically conclude that you say heter mitzdarf le'isser, that means the idea would be that the pasuk of Mishras was not needed to teach me Tam Ke'ikr because I know it from somewhere else, and therefore it's extra, and therefore I can learn the extra din of heter mitzdarf le'isser. Now, if that's the case, why is it extra? How do you know Tam Ke'ikr? Gemara says, Yalef and Basar B'chalef. Now, I just would point out to you that it's not clear that from here until the end of the Amud was everyone's girsa. And that's why, if you look at Tosfos at the top of the next Amud, he says that Kahn mekatzer lomar migule oled kechava. What Tosfos is saying is that if you look in Masechet Pesachim, Adaf Mem Daled and Beis, you'll find a parallel sugya, an almost identical sugya. And the Gemara in Pesachim actually has these next lines, but it seems like Tosfos did not have in his gears of the Gemara that these lines were here. And I think it would make sense. I didn't really have time to look around so much about this. It could be that it's even one of the little ha'aras on the side of the page. I'm using an old Gemara, so I don't have all of the new ha'aras, because yours has it. But if you look in the Mefarish and in Tosfos, they all ignore it. They don't have any commentary on the next few lines of the Gemara. So I think it's because in some gears of the Gemara, these next few lines didn't exist, and it seems like that's what Tosfos is saying on the top of the next Amud, that the Gemara over here actually omitted those lines. We'll learn it because it's on our page, but just recognize that it seems like some of the Rishonim did not have these next few lines. So the Gemara says, how does he know Tam Ke'eker? The Gemara says, Yalef mi Basar b'chalav. He learned it out from Basar b'chalav. And he explains, Lav Tam ba'amahu, if you analyze Basar b'chalav, so isn't that the Isra of Basar b'chalav, milk and meat together? Isn't that only the idea of having flavor together, ba'asar? Hachanami loshna. Same will be true over here. In other words, what he means to say is, of course, you can have a classic case of a person cooks meat and adds milk into the recipe, and he eats the milk and the meat together. That's definitely true. However, that's not the only case. If a person cooks milk and meat together, and then they take out the meat and only eat the meat, it definitely still is basar b'chalav. So now, when you think about it, just the logical inference is that if it's forbidden for me to eat the meat, why is that? It's because it's infused with the flavor of milk. Similarly, if I were to cook a piece of meat, chalila, in a pot of milk, and I take the meat out, it's also for me to drink that milk, even though the meat is out. So in other words, the halacha basar b'chalav itself dictates to us that tam ke'ikr, that the flavor itself is like the substance of the isser. And that's how he says, if there exists a halacha of basar b'chalav, if the Torah says, Lo savash l'gedi b'chalevimo, then that must be a proof that there's of tam ke'ikr. That must prove to us that the flavor is like the substance. Gemara says, Hachanami lo shnav Rabbanan. So Gemara says, hold on, why can't the Rabbanan learn it from basar b'chalav? In other words, that sounds very logical. In other words, just think about it. It's logical. If there is an existing isser of basar b'chalav, that should tell you that there is a problem of tam ke'ikr. The Gemara says, Rabbanan basar b'chalav lo garmina techidishu. You can't learn it out from basar b'chalav because basar b'chalav is a novelty. In other words, it's something which doesn't really make logical sense. My chidushay, what's the chiddush? If you're going to tell me the reason why it's a novelty is because each one by itself is permissible, right? Because no problem eating meat. There's no problem eating milk. Pitom, you mix them together, it creates an isser, which is something which is logically hard to understand. How could it be that I take two things that are permissible to be eaten, and all of a sudden when I mix them, it becomes usher? In other words, it's like telling me if I eat too many healthy foods, it becomes unhealthy. In other words, why should it become unhealthy? Just because I mix it together. Two healthy foods together should be two healthy foods. What's the logical understanding of why I take two kosher foods and mix them together? All of a sudden it becomes usher. It's a chiddush. Gemara says, it's fine, you're right, that is a chiddush, but that's just the way the Torah works. That's not a major chiddush. I'll show you, because Klayim Nami, Hailukudei Shari, Hailukudei Shari. When it comes to Klayim and all different areas of Klayim, wool, no problem, you can have a wool suit. Linen, you can have a linen suit, no problem. But the Torah says mixing them together creates an isser. The same thing is true with regard to the way that a person plows. A person, again, the different types of animals that they're allowed to use to plow together. And it comes to planting, and it comes to grafting. All these things, each one by itself is fine, but once you mix them, it becomes a problem. So in other words, don't be surprised by this idea that you take two kosher items, and independently they're kosher, but in combination they're going to be usher. My dear friend, that's how the Torah works. It's a chiddush, because the Torah is the chiddush. But once you're in the world of Torah, it shouldn't be such a chiddush that you can't learn anything else out from it. So Gemara says, what is indeed the chiddush of basar b'chalav over all other isum in the Torah? The Gemara says, Ella, it must be, the reason why the Rabbanan did not want to learn tam ke'ikr from basar b'chalav is because there is a unique chiddush when it comes to basar b'chalav. What is that? You take a piece of meat and you soak it in milk. Shari, what's the halacha? Midaraisa, you could take the meat out of the milk, rinse it off, and eat it. No problem. However, once you cook it, it becomes a problem. Now, I'm going to point out to you that there is a halacha called Kavash K'Muvashal. And Mir Hashem, maybe one day we'll learn Hilchos Melicha together in Siman Kofei and Shulchan Aruch. And over there we'll find out that it's not so simple that you could soak a piece of meat in milk, kula yoma, a whole day, and allow it to still be eaten. L'maisa, it's machlokas rishonim, and again, it's an exciting sugya to learn. But this simply it would have to soak me ace la'ace. 24 hours. Once it soaks me ace la'ace, we say kavash k'mavashal and maliach kiroseach. That's not our sugya today. But just without getting too technical on it, the halacha is if you soak meat in milk, the meat is still permissible to be eaten. Once you cook it for 1 second, it becomes asur. That's the chiddush. The chiddush is that cooking it makes it asur. But the combination is going to still be mutter. Whereas klayim, there's no halacha that you have to cook it. When it comes to shatnez, there's no halacha that if wool and linen mixed together, it's permissible until you cook your soup. There's no halacha. So therefore, you see that there's a chiddush when it comes to basar b'chalav, that there's something lo sevashel gedi b'chalevimo. Once you cook it, that's where the problem is. So said the Rabbanon, the whole halacha of basar b'chalav is a chiddush. So for the fact that we see tam ke'ikr, when it comes to basar b'chalav, says the Rabbanon, that's very nice, but you can't learn from there to the rest of the Torah, and therefore say the Rabbanon, we need to learn it out from Mishras. Now hold on a second. If that's true, then Rabbi Akiva, how do you learn tam ke'ikr from basar b'chalav? Rabbi Akiva nami basar b'chalav chidushu. These halachas that we said about cooking, lo savashla g'di b'chalevim, is a pasuk in the Torah. So therefore, how could it be Rabbi Akiva just learns tam ke'ikr from basar b'chalav? It's a chiddush, it's a novelty. It's not something which really makes logical sense. So therefore, basar b'chalav might be different. The Gemara says, Ella, and this is where everybody agrees. The Gemara continues, even those who take out these lines, the Gemara continues from here. Ella yalaf mi gi'uli ovdei kachavim. You learn it out from gi'uli ovdei kachavim. What's gi'uli ovdei kachavim? This is just in plain, simple English, the concept of kosher pots and pans. Gi'uli ovdei kachavim was the discussion, beginning of in Parshas Matos after the Melchama in Midyan. That's when we learned about the halacha of kashering kelim. So gi'uli ovdei kachavim literally means the expulsion or the expungement of flavors. I'm not sure what the right word is, but basically the idea that the absorbed flavors will come out. The Amar Achmana, kadavar shayavo be'esh. The Gemara goes through, the psukim go through the different halachas for kashering. In other words, if something was used over direct fire, it needs to be kasher with direct fire. Something was used with water, so then it has to be cooked with water. The concept of either kavola kachpalto, or again the halachas of hechsher kelim, a little bit complicated. But the basic idea is the way that a vessel was used with non-kosher food is exactly the way that you're going to kasher it to be able to get the flavor out. So now hold on a second. Think about that. You have a pot that a non-Jew used to cook food. Why can't I use it? He washed it out. It's clean. There's no non-kosher food left in the pot. What's the reason? The reason is because we assume that the flavor of the non-kosher food is going to be absorbed into those kelim. Then when I cook, the flavor is going to come out into my food. So here we have a very clear idea in the Torah of tam ke'ikr. There's no substance of the food. There's none of his cholent left in his pot. So therefore, why can't I use his pot? The answer is because his non-kosher food was absorbed. The flavor of his non-kosher food was absorbed into the pot. And then when I cook my food, the flavor now comes into my dish. Which is a clear example of tam ke'ikr. And the Gemara explains, Kodavar ashayava be'esh, lememra di isuri ovdei kachavim, lav taima ba'amahu va'aser. Don't we see that but when it comes to the foods of non-Jews, the only thing that's left in the pot is flavor for aser. So hachanami loshna. The same thing is true over here in every other case. We're able to say tam ke'ikr, and it's going to be forbidden. Now hold on a second. In other words, we have to try to understand why everyone has to find a different source for this halacha. In other words, if it's good enough for Rabbi Akiva to learn the halacha of tam ke'ikr from the kelim of non-Jews, why is it not good enough? For the Rabbanan, the Gemara says, the Rabbanan, Amarle, Hasam Nami Chidushu. Over there it's also a Chiddush. Why? Tabachal Torah Kula, When it comes to the rest of the Torah, no sein tam lifgam mutter. It's fascinating sugyas. In other words, there's so much of Hilchos Kashrus buried into this Amud over here. Says the Rabbanan, there's a halacha called no sein tam lifgam, which means that when I'm going to add the flavor of a forbidden food into my permissible food, it's only asur if the flavor that comes is no sein tam lishvach. It gives a good flavor. But if it adds a rancid flavor, if it adds a bad flavor, so much so that even when it comes to things which technically are not rancid, but the flavor that it adds is a putrid flavor that it gives to it, because it's just not a good mixture. The halacha is, no sein tam lifgam, if it gives a bad taste, it's going to be mutter. So now, what does this mean? That means that we generally assume that after 24 hours, this is the concept of a keli ben yomo. That means that after 24 hours, flavor starts to go bad. So even if a non-Jew cooked a delicious meal in his pot at 9 a.m. on Monday, by 9 a.m. on Tuesday, as delicious as that meal may have been, that flavor starts to go bad. Now, if one were to use that pot on Wednesday afternoon, or you can say even Tuesday afternoon, it's 24 hours later. The halacha is, the flavor that comes in there is no sein tam lifgam. It gives a negative or a sour flavor into your dish. And the halacha is, in kol Torah kula, no sein tam lifgam is going to be mutter. Gabi giuli ovid kichavim aser. Say the chachamim, look over here. We're talking about Mechemes Midyan. The general assumption is that the pots that they were gathering together, the kelim that they were taking as the booties of the war, that was stuff that was used more than 24 hours ago. And still the Torah said you have to kasher those kelim. Why? All the flavor that's absorbed into those pots have already gone rancid. Why? Because they're past 24 hours. So therefore, say the chachamim, I don't want to learn from Gi'ulei Ovdei Kechavim, from the flavors of the non-Jewish pots, because that was a chiddush that the Torah told you have to kasher those, because it's after 24 hours. The Gemara says, Rabbi Akiva nami hu chiddushu. Again, the logic should be the same for Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Huna barachia lo asra Torah el l'kdera bas yoma. The truth is, it's actually not true that the Torah told you have to kasher kelim that were used more than 24 hours ago. Now, we can get into the whole discussion of a suffix ben yomo, but generally the idea over here is that minat Torah, the Torah only required one to go ahead and kasher pots that were used that day. So whenever it was, if they were at war, you have to, again, the assumption was that they used those pots that day to make themselves breakfast, and they won the war by the end of the day. So now, at that day, if you want to cook dinner in those pots, they have to go ahead and kasher it. And what's the advantage of K'ter Bas Yoma? To lav no sein tam lifgamu. It's still on that day, the flavor that's absorbed into those pots actually is no sein tam lishvach. So the Gemara says, Rabbanon, K'ter Bas Yoma nami, iyaf shadlo pagma porta. So we're starting to get a little bit nitty gritty over here, but to say the chachamim, you have to understand, there's no switch that flips at 24 hours. In other words, there's no halacha that the flavor is going to be perfectly fine up until 24 hours later. And then, after 24 hours, already, it's not a ben yomo. You know what? What time? You check the clock, the second handle ticks, and then, boom! Now the flavor goes bad. Say the chachamim, there's a progression over here. After you take the food out of the pot, the flavor starts to slowly go rancid. So say the chachamim, the whole idea of flavor absorbed in a pot really is a chiddush, say the chachamim. Why? Because the flavor really starts to go bad very shortly after you start cooking it, and it starts to become pugum, it starts to lose its flavor very shortly afterwards. If the Torah requires us to go ahead and kasher that is a chiddush, and therefore you can't learn that to other cases of no sein tam lifgam. I just want to mention, we are running up against the clock, so we have to get moving, but in my 11th grade class, we learned the halachas of kashrus. When we finished the halachas of nat bar nat, which is no sein tam bar no sein tam, which is a little bit of a complicated part of Hilchos Kashrus, we went to the science lab and we took 4 brand new cast iron skillets and we did an experiment. We cooked water in the skillets and we took it out for our control, and then we cooked in some of the pots, and we compared it again. After we took out the water, we cooked fish. We fried fish in one of those pans, and we cooked hot peppers in another one of those pans. And then we took it out. We washed it out very well. We made sure it was perfectly clean. Then we went ahead and we cooked water again in those pots. And then we called in students who were not there when we did the experiment, and we had them taste the water to see what it tasted like. And I was actually a little bit nervous to do this experiment because I don't really know that the science of blias really works out so well, which is why I used cast iron. I thought it would give me a better chance. Now, the truth is, when it came to the flavor of the fish, they could not detect the flavor of the fish in the water that was cooked immediately afterwards. But when it came to the hot peppers, the kid who drank that water, like he drinks it, I have a video of it. If you go on Beth Phil's website, you can see it. There's a kid drinking it, he takes a sip, and he's like, oh, it's hot, it's spicy. So it does work. It does work. But anyway, let's go on. We got into this whole discussion of Tam Ke'ikr. But now let's get back to the sugya. Gemara says, from the Rabbanon, who use Mishras to teach us Tam Ke'ikr, that the flavor is like the substance, and they apply that to all other areas of halacha. Midrabanan nishmal Rabbi Akiva. We hear this idea of Rabbi Akiva that, according to Rabbi Akiva, who understands Mishras, teaches me hetem mitzaref le'isser. In other words, if it's good enough for the Rabbanan to teach me Tam Ke'ikr all over the Torah, it should be good enough for Rabbi Akiva to teach me hetem mitzaref le'isser all over the Torah. The Gemara says, "Lav ami Rabbanan hay Mishras litin Tam Ke'ikr u'mikanat tadon l'chol yisurim sheba Torah." Didn't the Rabbanan tell you that you learn Tam Ke'ikr to all the Yisurim of the Torah? Mikiva nami the kamokim lo lahai Mishras hetem mitzaref le'isser leimin mikanat tadon l'chol yisurim sheba Torah. It should make sense that we should learn that hetem mitzaref le'isser is relevant to all areas of the Torah. Amalei mishum. So you responded and said, you know what? No, it's not true. Mishum dahabi Nazir v'chatas beis ksuvim v'boin ke'echad u'chal beis ksuvim v'boin ke'echad ein melamdo. Sorry, I'm going a little bit fast. I just noticed that we only have 6 minutes left. He responds and says, it's not true. You can't use Mishras to teach me hetem mitzaref le'isser for all other Yisurim in the Torah. Why? Because the concept of Shnei Ksuvim V'Boin Ke'echad Ein Melamdo. What is that? It's a similar concept to Riboy Achar Riboy. If I have to point the Kiddush out to 2 separate places, then it must be that it's only those 2 places. In other words, generally speaking, the Torah will teach me a halacha and expect me to apply it across the board. If the Torah specifies 2 places where the halacha is true, then it's specifically those 2 places. So therefore, since it says this halacha of hetem mitzaref le'isser in 2 places, therefore it can't be applied to other cases. What are the 2 places? Nazir hadamarai. Nazir was the case of Mishras, like we said. Chatas mahi. What's the case of chatas? The Tanya first says in a brayso, kol sheyigav b'sar yikdash. Anytime you touch one carbon to the next, it's going to be kaddish. It will be sanctified. Yachal afilu shlo bala. I would think even without the bli, without the absorption of the flavor. Tamal over bibsara. The pasuk teaches me bibsara. Ad sheyivla bibsara. Until it gets absorbed into the basar, what happens then? Yikdash liyas kamoa. It becomes similar to it. What does that mean? Shem pesula. If I had a carbon which was pasul, which came into contact and transferred its flavor from one to the next. Shem pesula hi yipasel. This next carbon becomes pasul. V'im kesheroi. If it's kosher, tochal kachamer shaba. So if it's kosher, then it makes it more chamer. So for example, I'm sorry I'm going quick, but if you look at Tosfos, tochal. This means if you have, let's say, a chatas and a shlamim, the chatas comes into contact with the shlamim, then the shlamim that could only be eaten for zichrei kahuna, for mea kohanim, and lefnim and koim, which is a location, and it's only allowed to be eaten for 1 day and night. So according to Rabbi Akiva, you can't learn hetem mitzaref le'isser to other places because this halacha was specified specifically in 2 places, by Nazir and by chatas. Now hold on. According to the Rabbanan, now we have a problem. How did the Rabbanan learn Tam Ke'ikr all over the place? The Rabbanan tzrich, you have to have both. And now, if you have to have both, then the logic falls apart. In other words, is only if I have no reason why I have to say it twice. If I have no reason to say it twice, then saying it twice must be, it's there as an exclusion. If I have a reason why I have to say it twice, so then I can't say it's an exclusion. The reason why I said it is because it has to be there. With the Rabbanan say tzrich, you need it. If I would have only written this halach with regard to a chatas, I would say, hold on. You know why we had to write it in both places? Because you can't learn Nazir from Kachim. If I would only write it by Nazir, and I would expect to learn Kachim from there, I would think you can't learn a carbon from Nazir. Why? Because Nazir is very chamer. Why is the chamer? The Gemara explains that even the seeds. We saw Michartzan ve'adzag, the pasuk was clear. Even the seeds. I know there was a discussion previously in the Gemara whether the chartzan is seeds or the skins, but either way, the seeds also relate. So therefore, Hilkach le'asminei can't learn it from there. Rabbi Kiva, okay, it's Rabbi Kiva. So according to Rabbi Kiva, why does he say that it's considered extra to write it? In other words, why is he applying the concept of shtei ksuvah ka'echad over here? He shouldn't apply it. The Gemara says, Rabbi Kiva Amalach what do you do for however, Ella Lichter Rachmana Benazir. In other words, I understand you can't learn chulin from kachim. Fine. So then the Gemara says Ella Lichter Rachmana Benazir. Write up Benazir, learn from there. In other words, he's not going to buy into this idea. He says no problem. It's true that there are specific halachas that are relevant to Nazir, which are different than other places, which means that the grape seed is asr. That doesn't necessarily make it an unteachable place, just means that it's different. So he doesn't hold to this concept, you can't learn it from Nazir. You don't learn, but in other words, chatos was necessary. In other words, this is the kiddush over here. According to Chachamim, now what's coming out is now, Chatas does teach us that halacha had to be starved for Isser. So now, after all said and done, Chachamim hold of Tam Ke'ikar. Rabbi Kiva holds of Tam Ke'ikar. However, and they both also hold of this concept of had to be starved for Isser. And Chatas lehativ mitzaref Isser v'chulin mikachim legarminan u'mishros litin Tam Ke'ikar. So the Gemara is basically a summarizing of the year. You have Rabbanan, Chatas teaches you the concept of had to be starved for Isser. And chulin mikachim legarminan, you can't learn chulin from kachim to teach it all over the place. So it's only by chatas. So now, look at Rabbi Kiva. Rabbi Kiva, tarvayu, both of them let mitzaref l'isser. According to Rabbi Kiva, the difference is that he learns het mitzaref l'isser to teach you both of them. So therefore, he's stuck. In other words, the Chachamim, since they used mishras, they had something extra. According to Rabbi Kiva, you had to use both of those for het mitzaref l'isser, so he was stuck. Amarle, I think we have to stop over here. I would have loved to get to the 2 that's the time for Lama Chesed Beis, but we're hitting a heartbreak over here, 6:45. I'm sorry. All right, we'll have to finish tomorrow. Have a wonderful day.